Sometimes the greatest mystery is not why someone was taken, but why they were never truly harmed. Ethan Carter awoke to the soft sound of rain tapping against tall windows, his head heavy with confusion as pale morning light spilled across a room unlike anything he had ever seen. The bed beneath him was covered in crisp white linens, a stone fireplace flickered quietly in the corner, and shelves filled with beautifully bound books stretched from polished hardwood floors to an ornate ceiling painted with delicate gold accents. Nothing about the room resembled a prison, yet none of it belonged to him. He sat up slowly, trying to remember the previous evening. The last thing he clearly recalled was locking the front door of the small music studio where he taught piano lessons to neighborhood children on the north side of Chicago. After that, his memories dissolved into scattered fragments that refused to fit together. His breathing steadied as he noticed something unexpected. The bedroom door stood slightly open. No locks, no chains, no guards, only silence. Carefully placing his feet on the thick woven rug, Ethan walked toward the doorway and stepped into a wide hallway lined with family portraits illuminated by gentle morning sunlight. Somewhere below, he could hear faint piano music drifting through the enormous house. The melody was elegant yet strangely melancholy, as though every note carried memories too heavy for words. Drawn by curiosity more than fear, Ethan followed the music down a curved staircase overlooking a breathtaking indoor courtyard filled with olive trees and a marble fountain whose water shimmered beneath a glass ceiling. At the far end of the room, seated beside a grand piano, was a young woman quietly turning the pages of a novel. She looked up almost immediately, surprised to see him awake. Her expression held neither alarm nor hostility. Instead, she closed the book carefully and offered a polite smile that seemed as uncertain as his own. "You are finally awake," she said gently. Ethan stopped several feet away, searching her face for answers. "Where am I?" She hesitated before speaking. "You are safe." The reply only deepened the mystery. "That was not my question." She lowered her eyes for a brief moment. "I know." Before either of them could continue, the piano melody came to an end as though someone hidden elsewhere inside the estate had quietly lifted their hands from the keys. The silence that followed felt almost deliberate. Ethan studied the room around him. Fresh flowers rested on a nearby table. A tray holding breakfast had been prepared for him, untouched. Every detail suggested that someone had expected him to wake peacefully rather than as a frightened captive. None of it made sense. "Who are you?" he finally asked. The young woman met his eyes once more. "My name is Isabella Moretti." Ethan recognized the surname instantly. Newspaper headlines, business magazines, television reports. The Moretti family carried a reputation that inspired admiration from some and fear from others, always surrounded by rumors few people dared discuss openly. Before Ethan could ask another question, measured footsteps echoed across the marble floor behind him. A tall man dressed in a charcoal suit entered the courtyard with calm confidence, his silver watch catching the morning light as he approached. His presence carried quiet authority rather than raised voices or visible threats. He looked directly at Ethan and spoke with remarkable composure. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. I imagine you have many questions." Ethan answered without hesitation. "Only one matters. Why am I here?" The man held his gaze for several long seconds before replying. "Because there is a truth that cannot be explained until you see it for yourself. I do not measure people by the stories others tell about them, only by the choices they make when nobody is watching." Ethan held Adrian Moretti's steady gaze, searching for even the smallest hint of deception, but the powerful man standing before him revealed nothing beyond quiet confidence. The silence stretched across the marble courtyard until Adrian motioned toward the breakfast table. "Please eat. You will think more clearly afterward." Ethan remained where he was. "You expect me to sit down and have breakfast without knowing why I woke up in your house?" Adrian did not seem offended. Instead, he pulled out a chair for himself and calmly poured a cup of black coffee. "I expect nothing. You are free to refuse the meal." Ethan glanced toward the wide glass doors leading into the gardens. The gates beyond the courtyard appeared closed, yet there were no armed guards standing nearby, no raised voices, and no visible attempts to intimidate him. Everything about the estate felt strangely peaceful, making the unanswered questions even heavier. Isabella quietly stepped toward the breakfast table and placed a fresh cup of tea near the empty seat across from Adrian. "You have not eaten since yesterday afternoon," she said softly. "At least have something warm." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Her voice carried genuine concern rather than obligation. Reluctantly, he sat down, more interested in finding answers than tasting the food arranged before him. Fresh fruit, homemade bread, scrambled eggs, and orange juice rested neatly on polished silver trays. It looked less like a hostage's meal and more like breakfast prepared for an honored guest. Adrian folded his hands calmly. "You teach piano?" Ethan nodded cautiously. "Yes. You have done so for nearly 7 years." Ethan frowned. "You know far too much about me." Adrian accepted the observation without denying it. "I know enough to believe you deserve to be brought here safely rather than questioned somewhere less comfortable." Ethan set his fork back onto the plate untouched. That sentence answered nothing. A faint smile appeared on Isabella's face before disappearing just as quickly. She seemed almost relieved that someone had spoken to her brother so directly. Adrian noticed her reaction but continued without changing his tone. "You are wondering whether you are in danger." "Should I be?" Ethan asked. Adrian answered immediately. "No." The certainty in his voice sounded sincere, yet sincerity alone could not erase confusion. After breakfast ended, Adrian rose from the table. "There are only 2 places inside this estate that remain private. Every other room, garden, library, and music hall is open to you." Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "You are giving me permission to explore." "Permission is the wrong word," Adrian replied. "Consider it an invitation." Without another explanation, he quietly left the courtyard. Ethan watched him disappear down the eastern hallway before turning toward Isabella. "Does he always speak in riddles?" She laughed softly for the first time that morning. "Only when he believes the truth will make more sense if someone discovers it instead of hearing it." Ethan leaned back in his chair, frustration mixing with reluctant curiosity. "Does anyone in this house answer a simple question?" Isabella picked up the novel she had been reading earlier and smiled with gentle understanding. "Sometimes simple questions have complicated answers." She stood and walked toward the open doors leading into the gardens. "Come with me." Ethan hesitated only briefly before following her outside. Morning sunlight reflected across a peaceful pond surrounded by flowering cherry trees, while the distant sound of piano music drifted through the estate once again. It was beautiful enough to make him forget, if only for a moment, the impossible circumstances that had brought him there. As they reached a quiet stone bridge crossing the water, Isabella stopped walking and looked toward a weathered bronze statue standing beneath an old oak tree. "Everything began there," she whispered. "If you understand why that memorial exists, you will begin to understand why my brother searched for you." Some memories remain hidden for years until a single familiar face quietly unlocks them again. Ethan followed Isabella along a winding stone path bordered by carefully trimmed hedges and blooming white roses, the cool autumn breeze carrying the gentle scent of cedar through the peaceful gardens. Nothing about the estate matched the image he had formed after hearing the Moretti name throughout Chicago. Instead of cold extravagance, there was a quiet elegance that seemed built around memories rather than wealth. They stopped before the weathered bronze statue standing beneath the towering oak tree. It portrayed an older man seated beside a young boy at a piano, their hands resting together above the keys. A simple inscription at the base. "Read. To those who teach without asking for recognition." Ethan studied the sculpture carefully. "Who are they?" Isabella rested her fingertips lightly against the cool bronze. "My father and the man who taught him music when he was a child." Ethan looked at her with growing curiosity. "Your father played the piano?" She smiled softly. "Every evening. No matter how busy life became, he always believed music reminded people who they were before the world asked them to become someone else." The words lingered between them as birds drifted across the pale morning sky above the gardens. Ethan could not help noticing the sadness that quietly settled over Isabella whenever she spoke about her family. She did not sound bitter. She sounded as though she missed a version of life that no longer existed. "And your brother?" Ethan asked gently. Isabella glanced toward the mansion before answering. "Adrian learned to protect people long before he learned how to trust them." Ethan remained silent, sensing there was far more behind that sentence than she wished to explain. They continued walking until they reached a quiet greenhouse filled with orchids, ivy, and rows of fragrant herbs growing beneath the glass roof. Sunlight poured through the panes, painting delicate patterns across the stone floor. Isabella carefully watered one of the flowering plants before speaking again. Most people believe they know everything about our family because they have heard stories. Very few have ever asked whether those stories were complete. Ethan folded his arms thoughtfully. I still do not know why I am here. Isabella nodded. Neither do I. Adrian never tells me everything until he believes the time is right. She looked directly into his eyes with quiet honesty. But I do know one thing. If my brother truly intended to harm you, you would never have been given this freedom. Ethan considered everything he had experienced since waking inside the estate. No locked doors, no threats, no demands. Every answer only created another question. His attention shifted toward a grand piano standing in the corner of the greenhouse, its polished black surface reflecting streams of golden light. There is a piano here too? Isabella laughed softly. There are 3. Music has always been part of this house. Ethan walked toward the instrument almost instinctively, brushing his fingertips across the smooth wood before gently pressing a single key. The clear note echoed through the greenhouse with remarkable warmth. Without thinking, he allowed his hands to settle on the keyboard and quietly began playing a familiar melody he often taught his youngest students. Isabella closed her eyes as the music filled the room, her expression softening with every measure. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Ethan saw genuine peace replace the quiet loneliness she carried. When the final note faded into silence, neither of them spoke for several moments. Then a slow round of applause echoed from the greenhouse entrance. Ethan turned to see Adrian standing there alone, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded. That is the same piece, Adrian said quietly, that someone played for my father on the day his life changed forever, and that is why I needed to find you. Truth rarely arrives all at once because the human heart is seldom ready to carry its full weight in a single moment. Ethan slowly stood from the piano bench, the final notes of the melody still lingering beneath the glass ceiling of the greenhouse. Adrian stepped farther inside, his polished shoes making almost no sound against the stone floor. Isabella quietly moved aside, sensing that a conversation years in the making was finally about to begin. Ethan folded his arms. You said that peace changed your father's life. What does that have to do with me? Adrian looked toward the grand piano before answering. More than 30 years ago, my father was a frightened young man trying to rebuild his life after losing almost everything. He met an elderly piano teacher who offered him lessons even when he could not afford them. That teacher believed music could restore hope where words could not. Ethan listened carefully, recognizing something familiar in the story. Adrian continued, his voice calm and measured. My father often spoke about the teacher's son, a talented young musician who practiced that exact melody every afternoon while waiting for his own students to arrive. Ethan searched his memory. His father had spent decades teaching neighborhood children from a modest studio filled with worn sheet music and secondhand instruments. There had been countless stories about families whose lives had crossed his father's path, but names had faded with time. My father never mentioned the Moretti family, Ethan said quietly. Adrian nodded. He probably knew us by another name. Long before our family built this estate, our lives looked very different. Ethan noticed that Adrian deliberately avoided explaining further. There was no attempt to justify the family's complicated reputation, only an acknowledgement that much had changed over the years. Isabella stepped closer to the piano and gently closed the music stand. Our father believed gratitude should never expire, she said softly. He searched for your family for years after your father retired, but every address he had became outdated. Ethan felt a quiet ache in his chest. His father had passed away only 2 years earlier after living a simple life devoted almost entirely to teaching music. He had never spoken about expecting recognition from anyone he had helped. If this is about thanking my father, Ethan asked, why was I not simply invited here? Adrian lowered his eyes briefly before answering with complete honesty. Because I was afraid you would refuse before allowing me to explain. Ethan let out a slow breath. You decided that for me. Adrian did not argue. Yes, and that decision was mine alone. The admission hung in the air without excuse or justification. Ethan had expected denial, perhaps even another carefully worded mystery. Instead, Adrian accepted responsibility without trying to soften it. That unexpected honesty made it difficult to respond with the anger Ethan had been carrying since waking inside the estate. Silence settled over the greenhouse while sunlight drifted across rows of blooming orchids. Finally, Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a weathered photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. He handed it to Ethan without saying a word. The faded picture showed two smiling men standing beside an upright piano inside a tiny music studio. One was unmistakably Ethan's father as a young man. The other looked remarkably like the older man portrayed in the bronze statue beneath the oak tree. Written carefully across the back in blue ink were only 6 words. Friendship begins with one kind lesson. Ethan traced the familiar handwriting with his fingertips, realizing it belonged to his father. Before he could gather his thoughts, Adrian quietly spoke again. There is one part of this story that even my sister does not know yet, and until you hear it, nothing about your presence here will truly make sense. The past has a quiet way of waiting until the right people are finally ready to hear it. Adrian looked at the faded photograph one last time before carefully placing it back into its protective sleeve. His expression remained composed, but there was unmistakable emotion behind his steady voice. The man standing beside your father was my grandfather, Antonio Moretti. Ethan glanced at the photograph again, comparing the younger face to the bronze statue in the garden. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Isabella looked surprised. Grandfather never told us they stayed in touch. Adrian nodded slowly. They did not. Life carried them in different directions, but grandfather never forgot the kindness your family showed him during the hardest years of his life. Ethan remained silent, allowing the story to unfold naturally. Adrian continued walking toward one of the greenhouse windows where the afternoon sunlight illuminated rows of white orchids. Before our family became successful, my grandfather worked long hours doing whatever jobs he could find. Music lessons were something he could never afford, yet your grandfather refused to accept payment after realizing how much those lessons meant to him. He simply said that hope was worth more than money. Ethan smiled faintly. That sounds exactly like him. Adrian nodded. Years later, when my father was still a little boy, he inherited that same kindness. Your father became his first music teacher. He never charged him. He simply opened the studio door every Saturday morning. Isabella lowered her eyes thoughtfully. That explains why father insisted every home we owned must always have a piano. Adrian smiled for the first time that afternoon. He believed every note reminded him of a debt that could never truly be repaid. Ethan slowly sat beside the piano once again, running his fingertips lightly across the smooth ivory keys without pressing them. Memories of his own childhood quietly returned. He remembered helping his father arrange folding chairs before neighborhood recitals, carrying stacks of music books, and watching children from every background gather inside the tiny studio where everyone was welcomed exactly the same way. His father rarely spoke about the past because he believed kindness should never become a story people told to earn admiration. If all of this is true, Ethan finally asked, why spend years searching for me? Adrian turned to face him. Because after my father passed away, I found a letter hidden inside his desk. He removed another carefully folded document from a leather folder resting nearby. The paper had yellowed with age, its edges softened by time. Adrian unfolded it with extraordinary care. He wrote that if he ever had the opportunity, he wanted our family to help the descendants of the people who had once helped ours. Not with gifts, not with charity, with opportunity. Ethan accepted the letter quietly, recognizing his father's name mentioned near the bottom in graceful handwriting. The words were simple. They spoke about gratitude, friendship, and the belief that kindness should continue moving forward instead of ending with one generation. Ethan looked up slowly. So you searched for me because of a promise? Adrian answered without hesitation. Yes. Ethan took a long breath before asking the question that had remained in his heart since arriving. Then why not simply write me a letter? Adrian's expression became noticeably more reflective. Because I had spent too many years solving every problem through control. I believed bringing you here guaranteed I would finally fulfill my father's wish. I see now that good intentions do not excuse taking away another person's choice. The honesty of the confession settled quietly over the room. Ethan could hear only the gentle rustling of leaves outside the greenhouse. For the first time, he realized Adrian was not asking for forgiveness. He was admitting he had been wrong, and that quiet admission changed the entire conversation in ways neither of them had expected. The strongest bonds are never built by obligation because they begin only when every door has been left open. The afternoon sunlight slowly faded across the greenhouse as Adrian carefully folded his father's letter and returned it to the leather folder. No one spoke for several moments. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. Instead, it carried the quiet weight of truths that had waited decades to be shared. Finally, Adrian looked directly at Ethan with an expression that held neither authority nor expectation. "There is one final thing I must do." He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small silver key attached to a simple leather tag. Without ceremony, he placed it gently on the piano beside Ethan. "That is the front gate key," he said. "Every entrance to this estate can now be opened from the inside. A driver is already waiting if you wish to return to Chicago today." Ethan stared at the key, surprised by how ordinary it looked after everything that had happened. Adrian continued before Ethan could respond. "You arrived here without a choice. You will leave only by your own decision. Whether you stay another hour or never return again will be entirely yours." Isabella quietly watched her brother, unable to hide the surprise in her eyes. She had never seen Adrian surrender control so completely. Ethan picked up the small key and turned it slowly between his fingers. For the first time since waking inside the estate, he no longer felt trapped. The realization changed something inside him immediately. Questions driven by fear began giving way to curiosity born from trust. "You are not asking me to forgive you," Ethan said. Adrian shook his head. "Forgiveness is not something another person can request. It is something they may choose to offer one day, or not at all." Ethan looked toward Isabella, who offered a gentle smile that seemed brighter than before. She stepped closer and spoke softly. "No matter what you decide, thank you for listening today." Ethan nodded with quiet appreciation. "Thank you for telling me the truth." Later that afternoon, Isabella invited Ethan to walk through the western gardens before his driver departed. The estate stretched across rolling hills painted with the warm colors of early autumn. Maple trees shimmered in shades of gold and crimson, while a gentle breeze carried fallen leaves across winding stone paths. They walked without urgency, speaking not about family history or unanswered mysteries, but about ordinary things that somehow felt far more important. Ethan shared stories about his young piano students who celebrated every new song as though it were a concert performance. Isabella laughed as she admitted she secretly collected classic novels from small independent bookstores whenever she visited the city. They discovered a shared love for quiet mornings, handwritten letters, and old jazz recordings that crackled softly through vintage speakers. Conversation flowed so naturally that neither noticed how much time had passed until the distant church bells announced the beginning of evening. As they reached a hill overlooking the gardens, Ethan paused to admire the sunset reflecting across a peaceful lake. "This place feels completely different now," he admitted. Isabella looked toward the fading horizon. "Places rarely change in a single day. Sometimes only our understanding does." Ethan smiled thoughtfully. He realized she was right. The estate had not become more beautiful since morning. It was his fear that had slowly disappeared. In the distance, Adrian stood alone on the terrace outside the mansion, watching the two of them from afar without interrupting their conversation. He turned quietly and walked back inside, leaving them the freedom to remain exactly where they wished. Ethan slipped the small silver key into his jacket pocket, no longer seeing it as a way to leave, but as a reminder that every meaningful decision from this moment forward would belong entirely to him. The hardest journey is often the one that leads us back to the life we thought we wanted. The following morning arrived beneath a sky washed in pale blue as sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the estate. Ethan stood alone in the guest room where he had first awakened, his small travel bag resting on the neatly made bed. Everything he had brought with him fit inside that single bag, yet it somehow felt heavier than before. The silver key Adrian had given him remained safely inside his jacket pocket. It was no longer simply a key to the front gate. It had become proof that every choice ahead belonged entirely to him. A quiet knock sounded at the door. Isabella stepped inside, carrying a small paper bag from the estate bakery. "For the drive," she said with a warm smile. "Fresh cinnamon rolls. They taste better before noon." Ethan accepted the bag with a grateful laugh. "Thank you." I never imagined my strangest week would also include the best breakfast pastries I have ever had. Isabella smiled, but there was a quiet sadness behind her eyes. Neither did I. They walked together through the grand entrance hall where morning light reflected across polished marble floors. Adrian was already waiting beside the open front doors. A black sedan stood at the end of the circular driveway with its engine quietly running. Ethan stopped a few feet away from Adrian. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Adrian extended his hand. I owe you an apology that words alone cannot complete. Ethan looked at the offered hand before accepting it firmly. You made the wrong choice at the beginning. Adrian nodded. I did. Ethan continued. But you also made the right choice before it was too late. A faint expression of relief crossed Adrian's face. I hope one day that matters. Ethan released the handshake and glanced once toward Isabella. She stood silently beside the doorway, the morning breeze gently moving strands of her light hair across her face. There were countless things he wanted to say, yet none of them seemed large enough to capture what had quietly grown between them during the past few days. Instead, he simply said, "Take care of yourself." Isabella answered with a gentle smile. You too. Ethan entered the waiting car, and moments later the estate slowly disappeared behind rows of towering oak trees as the vehicle made its way toward downtown Chicago. The familiar streets welcomed him home with busy intersections, neighborhood coffee shops, and the comforting sound of city life. His modest apartment looked exactly as he had left it. His piano studio remained filled with eager students who greeted him with excited smiles the following afternoon, asking whether he had enjoyed his unexpected vacation. Ethan simply smiled and said that it had been unforgettable. Days passed, then another week. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm, yet something inside him had quietly changed. Every evening after finishing his lessons, he found himself remembering conversations beneath autumn trees, music echoing through the greenhouse, and the peaceful expression on Isabella's face whenever she listened to him play. He realized he missed not the luxury of the estate, but the person who had made it feel unexpectedly warm. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Ethan unlocked his apartment mailbox and found a simple cream-colored envelope waiting inside. There was no family crest, no official seal, only his name written neatly across the front in elegant handwriting he immediately recognized. Inside rested a single pressed white rose and a handwritten note that contained only one sentence. Some melodies deserve to be finished together. The heart recognizes home long before the mind is willing to admit it. Ethan read the handwritten note several times, gently tracing the elegant letters with his fingertips as rain tapped softly against the apartment window. There was no request, no promise, and no expectation hidden within those few words. Isabella had not asked him to return. She had simply shared what she felt, leaving the decision entirely in his hands. That quiet respect stirred something deeper than longing. It reminded him of the lesson Adrian had finally learned. Love could never begin where choice did not exist. The following morning, Ethan finished his piano lessons earlier than usual. He carefully placed the pressed white rose inside the same music book his father had once carried to every lesson, then locked the studio door and stood for a long moment on the sidewalk. The city moved around him with its familiar rhythm. Buses rolled through busy intersections, neighbors greeted one another outside small cafes, and children hurried home carrying backpacks nearly as large as they were. It was the life he had always loved, yet for the first time he realized that loving one place did not prevent the heart from finding another. Without overthinking the decision, Ethan drove toward the Moretti estate alone. There was no escort waiting for him, no invitation delivered by anyone else, and no obligation guiding his hands on the steering wheel. Every mile belonged entirely to his own choice. By late afternoon, the familiar iron gates appeared ahead. Ethan slowed the car and smiled as he reached into his jacket pocket for the small silver key Adrian had given him days earlier. The gate opened smoothly, not because someone welcomed him from the inside, but because he chose to step forward on his own. As he followed the winding driveway beneath rows of towering maple trees glowing with autumn color, he noticed the estate looked exactly as he remembered. The gardens remained peaceful, the fountains continued their quiet song, and sunlight reflected warmly across the stone walls of the mansion. Nothing had changed except the reason for his arrival. Before he reached the front entrance, Isabella appeared on the wide terrace, holding a book she had clearly forgotten to keep reading. Surprise filled her face for only a heartbeat before a genuine smile replaced it. She slowly walked down the stone steps to meet him. "You came back," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "This time because I wanted to." Those simple words carried more meaning than either of them needed to explain. Isabella looked toward the open front gate in the distance before meeting his eyes again. "No one asked you to return." Ethan smiled. "Exactly." For several quiet moments, they simply stood together beneath the golden leaves drifting gently through the afternoon air. There was no need for dramatic declarations. Their silence felt complete all by itself. A few moments later, the front door opened, and Adrian stepped outside. He looked first at Ethan, then toward the open gate that still remained unlocked behind him. A faint smile crossed his face. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter." Ethan extended his hand first this time. Adrian accepted it with quiet gratitude. "I am not here because of a promise made years ago," Ethan said calmly. "I came because I wanted to continue writing the next chapter myself." Adrian nodded with deep respect. "Then this house welcomes you as a guest, and nothing more. Every decision after today remains yours." As evening settled over the estate, the three of them walked toward the greenhouse where the grand piano waited beneath the glass roof. Ethan sat at the bench once again. Isabella turned the pages of the music book, and for the first time Adrian quietly took a seat among the listeners instead of standing apart. When Ethan's hands touched the keys, the melody no longer sounded like the ending of an old story. It sounded like the beginning of one freely chosen by everyone who now shared the room. Some stories do not end with grand celebrations because the most meaningful endings are simply peaceful beginnings. 6 months passed as the seasons quietly changed, and the Moretti estate became a place Ethan visited often, never out of obligation, but always by his own choice. He continued teaching piano in Chicago during the week, inspiring children with the same patience his father had once shown every student who walked through the old studio door. On weekends, he drove through the familiar iron gates carrying sheet music beneath one arm and homemade pastries beneath the other, smiling each time the silver key remained untouched in his pocket because the gates were now always open before he arrived. Isabella often met him in the gardens with another novel waiting to be discussed or another quiet path waiting to be explored together. Their relationship grew naturally through shared mornings, long conversations beneath the maple trees, evenings spent playing duets on the grand piano, and countless moments filled with laughter instead of dramatic promises. Neither of them hurried toward the future. They allowed trust to become the foundation beneath every feeling they shared. Adrian watched the change with quiet satisfaction. He had discovered that respect could never be commanded as easily as it could be earned. Gradually, he transformed more than his own outlook. The Moretti Foundation expanded its music scholarship program, restoring community music rooms throughout Chicago and providing instruments to children whose families could not afford them. Every new piano carried a small brass plaque engraved with the same sentence Ethan had found on the back of the old photograph. "Friendship begins with one kind lesson." Adrian never placed his own name beneath those words. He believed some gifts should remain connected to the people who first inspired them. One crisp autumn afternoon, the greenhouse hosted its first public recital for young musicians from neighborhoods across the city. Parents filled the chairs, children nervously adjusted their sheet music, and soft applause echoed beneath the glass ceiling after every performance. Ethan stood proudly beside the students as they took their bows, while Isabella welcomed each family with genuine warmth that made every guest feel equally important. Adrian remained near the back of the audience, smiling quietly as he watched the room come alive with music instead of silence. Near the end of the recital, Ethan invited one final performer to the piano. It was an elderly music teacher who had once worked alongside Ethan's father many years before. As the familiar melody began filling the greenhouse, Adrian looked toward the bronze memorial visible through the glass walls and imagined his father listening somewhere beyond memory, knowing that a single act of kindness had continued traveling across generations exactly as he had once hoped. When the final note faded, the audience rose together in heartfelt applause. Ethan turned toward Isabella, and without speaking, gently reached for her hand. She smiled and accepted it with complete certainty, because this choice belonged equally to both of them. Adrian quietly stepped outside, giving them the privacy they deserved. He looked toward the open front gates standing beneath the golden afternoon light, and realized they had remained unlocked for months. They no longer represented security or power. They represented trust. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the hills, laughter drifted from the greenhouse into the gardens, carried gently by the evening breeze. The promise that had begun decades earlier through a simple piano lesson had finally become something even greater than gratitude. It had become a future freely chosen by every heart involved. And on that peaceful autumn evening, everyone present remembered that the strongest love is never created by fate alone. It grows through kindness, honesty, forgiveness, and the freedom to choose one another every single day.